at session number 10 in our online series of Bible studies. We're looking at plague number 5 of the 9 plague series God used to bring his people Israel out of the bondage of Egypt. We call this the plague of livestock because the livestock are the ones that take the brunt of the consequences. I'd like to begin by trying to give you an impression of how I think the common Egyptian may have felt, or what the common Egyptian may have been thinking about as these plagues wear on. You know, the common person was in the middle of it. It wasn't just Pharaoh and his henchmen, but everyone. It's going to look a little different, so hang with me. Just check it out. Remember that Pharaoh was a god to the Egyptians, a low-level god, actually a god between the big gods and the people. And as God, he was specifically responsible for maintaining order out of the disorder that typically characterized the universe in their minds. So he is to keep order. And so these plagues represent, of course, disorder. So the 5 lines go something like this. Pharaoh, keeper of order, not. Yahweh leads you for to naught. This mess reeks. It's gone on for weeks, and our gods are left most distraught. So here we are in the 5th plague. And if you're counting by numbers, remember the 9 plagues are broken into 3 trios, 3 sets of 3 plagues each. So plague number 5 would be plague number 2 of trio number 2. And every trio had its own purpose, in this case, very simple purpose, to teach Pharaoh that Yahweh was operating in Egypt. And several characteristics. The first place, the second plagues in each trio were a case of Moses going to Pharaoh. And they were probably at Pharaoh's palace, where remember the first ones, the first plagues of each trio, the meeting place would have been by the Nile. But here, it's probably at Pharaoh's palace. And in each case, in both first and second plagues of each trio, there's a warning with consequences. And the consequences have gotten more severe with each new plague. And this plague will be more severe than each of the 4 that went before that. So that's where we are. There's no mention of Aaron. Moses is evidently by himself this time. There's no mention of Pharaoh's henchmen either. And you know that in the plague of gnats, they said, Pharaoh, we can't touch it. We're out of here. There's nothing we can do against this God of some power. Why is that important? Well, one of the reasons is that magic and religion were identical in Egypt. There was no separation. The magicians were religious elite. The wise men were religious elite, some of them. And the sorcerers were religious elite. And so with the religious elite defeated and out of the picture after the gnat episode, all of the responsibility falls squarely on Pharaoh's shoulder. So the pressure's on him right now. Let's take a second out and look at another cultural note, and that is very interesting. A lot of people will try and convince you that these plagues were natural occurrences, totally natural, and you can explain the likelihood of natural events in each of these cases. That wouldn't have bothered the Hebrews because they said everything that goes on, our God, Yahweh, is sovereign. So whatever goes on, it is either at his direction or with his permission. So in a sense, every natural event is an act of God. So we're not going to worry about whether you think this is a natural event without any miraculous intervention. But when you see all 9 of them lined up, you're going to have a problem saying it was purely natural, just accidentally happened. Well, let's remember now that Moses, in both of the first 2 plagues of each trio, would have given a warning. And that warning, in the case of this particular trio, that warning is all that's required to trigger the events. As soon as Moses gives the warning to Pharaoh, then Yahweh is free to trigger this event. So we don't need canes, we don't need rods, we don't need banging on the ground, we don't need anything. Moses just says, here's what God says, this is the way it is. And so that's enough. Remember why, let's not forget why all of this is taking place. I mean, you don't just go through a whole bunch of this stuff and say, well, you were worried about this plague or that plague. Is it natural? Is it miraculous? Did it really interfere with the Egyptian life? Who cares? Well, the Egyptians cared, that's for sure. But there was a purpose to all of this. It wasn't something that just happened. And the purpose was that God said, I am going to redeem my Hebrew people. I'm going to release hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people from the oppression and slavery of Egypt. I'm going to reconcile them to myself. The entire nation will become my nation of priests. So that's why we're doing this. God has a major event in mind, and that's when the Hebrews walk out of Egypt. And by the way, in the history of the nation of Israel, this is the single most important event of redemption, of the work of their God on their behalf. So let's look at the destruction that Moses was going to promise. We're going to look at Exodus 9, beginning in verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him, excuse me, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, release my people that they may serve me. For if you refuse to release them and continue holding them, then the hand of the Lord will surely bring a very terrible plague. You'll see the term murrain, M-U-R-R-A-I-N, used, and means simply a fatal disease. Then the hand of the Lord will surely bring a very terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. So there's the threat of destruction of the Egyptian livestock. Now look at verse 4. But the Lord will distinguish, here we go again, this is the second time. The Lord will distinguish between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt. And nothing will die of all that the Israelites have. There's not going to be a single Israelite livestock animal lost. The Lord set an appointed time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land, meaning the land of Egypt. So God says, I'm going to wipe out a lot of Egyptian livestock, maybe all of it, but I'm going to wipe out Egyptian livestock. I'm not going to touch Israeli livestock. It's going to be through a terrible plague or disease, some kind, and it's going to happen tomorrow, not today. It's going to happen tomorrow. That warning about the timing tomorrow is interesting. What does it do? Well, it gives Pharaoh some time to think about his reaction, which he's always just rejected whatever God claimed or said or ordered. But he gives him some time to think about it. It actually may have given some of the Egyptian people some time also. Because remember, the claim was the livestock in the field. So they would have had overnight to get their livestock out of the field if that was their concern. If they believed that God was going to kill everything standing around in a field, maybe they could protect their animals by bringing them in out of the field. Well, that's something to keep in mind. But where did this tomorrow stuff get started? Do you remember? It started in plague number 2 when the frogs were there and Pharaoh wanted Moses to get rid of the frogs and said, Moses looked to him and says, okay, you pick the time, you pick the day. A little bit of a challenge. And Pharaoh said, well, let's see if you can pull it off. Let's go tomorrow. So, in matter of fact, Moses prayed his heart out. And on the next day, the tomorrow that came, the frogs died. There weren't any frogs left alive on the land of Egypt. Well, then remember last time in this fly episode, Moses said, when Pharaoh says, I could get rid of these flies, and Moses said, I'll get rid of them for you tomorrow. And he gave him another warning, don't mess with God by lying to him again like you did before. And so the next day, Moses got rid of the flies. Well, here now, Moses is saying not the getting rid of part, but the actual beginning of the plague will begin tomorrow. So he's carrying that through. It's kind of like rubbing Pharaoh's face in it, it would seem to me. May not have been intended to look that way, but it looked to me like that could have had some measure of force. So once again, the plague is going to distinguish between Egyptian and Hebrew livestock. It's as if God's going and looking straight in Pharaoh's eyes and say, I can protect my people, Pharaoh, but you cannot protect yours. The Pharaoh, in his sense, was what? When it comes to matching Yahweh face to face, Pharaoh is impotent. Well, let's take a look at another term that was used in the last verses that we looked at. Moses used the term hand of God. Remember, Pharaoh's henchmen had used the term finger of God. This is the finger of God. We can't do this. We can't touch it. So Moses used the hand of God. Well, that hand of God, of course, was just an indication or a metaphor for his power and his willingness to work on behalf of the Israelites. Isaiah 41:10, for example, says, God speaking, don't be afraid, for I'm with you. Don't be frightened, for I'm your God. I strengthen you. Yes, I help you. Yes, I uphold you with my strong right hand. And in Deuteronomy, speaking of these same events of bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, Deuteronomy 7, beginning in verse 7, says, it was not because you were more in number than any other people, speaking of the Israelites, of course, that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you, there's the reason why God does what he does, and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, so that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And in one more, Daniel in chapter 9, verse 15 says much the same thing about this same event. And now, O Lord, our God, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and have made a name for yourself, as at this day we have sinned, we have done wickedly. And Daniel's wanting to begin a corporate sense of repentance for the way Israel has treated Yahweh. So let's back up a minute. Let's go back to that verse 3 again, where the key was that God said, I'm going to kill all of the livestock in the field. But the fate of the livestock that are not in the field doesn't fall into that threat. Does it? Would God have killed all the livestock that are in the stables? We don't know. It's not an issue that's discussed. Anyhow, let's look at verse 6 of chapter 9. And the Lord did this, that is, he brought this plague, on the next day. All the livestock of the Egyptians died. Well, does that mean all the livestock in the field or all the livestock, period? We don't know. It's hyperbole again. He's just saying there's an awful lot of livestock that's going to be dead. Let me see, where was I? But of the Israelites' livestock, not one died. There is that distinction. God favored his people. Pharaoh sent representatives to investigate, verse 7, and indeed they found not one of the livestock of Israel had died, but Pharaoh's heart remained hard, and he did not release the people. Well, God acted right on schedule the next day. Again, a little bit of hyperbole going on there, but what about those livestock in the field? How do you think they died? Well, nobody knows for sure, but the suspicion is that it was because of anthrax. Stop and think about it for a moment. When this all started, it was dead fish in the Nile. Dead fish are going to create bacteria, and an anthrax-related bacteria, by the way. And who would have been in the Nile taking in this infection? Frogs. But in plague number 2, where were the frogs? All over the countryside of Egypt. When the frogs died, what would have been on the piles of dead frogs? All manner of insects, to include flies. And the flies were said to have been on all of the people, including Pharaoh and his guys. And remember, there was a special statement that said they were on the ground, which could have spread the anthrax germs all over the land of Egypt. Is that what happened? I don't have a clue, but it could have. But it would have taken an awfully lot of manipulation for it all to happen in the way that Exodus describes it. But no matter which way you see those things, it seemed to have been a case of all livestock go or no livestock go. Either they're Egyptian livestock or they're Hebrew livestock. Either it's an act of judgment or it's an act of sparing, an act of mercy. How about that? The idea that the Israelites were receiving some mercy. Uh, but notice, why did he think Pharaoh had men go check out to see if any Israeli livestock died? He wasn't going to change his mind. His heart was hardened already. He was made up in his own mind what he was going to do. Well, why did he bother? Whether it's true or not, he wasn't going to repent. Well, note it doesn't say that Pharaoh hardened his heart, but that his heart remained hard. So Pharaoh already has a hardened heart, perhaps even permanently hardened at this point. But he might have had some other way of saying, I want to told you so. God couldn't separate out the Hebrew livestock and protect them, but he did. So what do we see? Well, in the midst of all of these plagues, when he's standing toe to toe with Yahweh, Pharaoh is impotent. So are all of the Egyptian gods. None of the Egyptian gods have had any effect, been able to stop Yahweh in any sense of the word. And there were a number of gods that would have been involved at this point in the minds of the Egyptians anyhow. One called Apis, who is a bull, and he represents the god which I call Ptah, P-T-A-H. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. Then there's Ra, R-A, who is the calf god. And we're going to see him later. He's one of the two biggies along with Happy. There's Hathor, which we've mentioned before. She's the goddess of cows. There's Khnum, or Khnum, whichever, I don't know how you pronounce that either, K-H-N-U-M. He is the ram god. And then there is one final god, Faustitas. That's not Fajitas for you Cinco de Mayo types. It's Faustitas, who is the goddess of livestock. These, among many others, remember there are about 2,000 Egyptian gods at that time. So they're all impotent when they're faced with Yahweh. So what's the scorecard look like at this point? Pharaoh 0, Yahweh 5. Egyptian gods zip, Yahweh 5. It's always 5 to zip, 4 to zip, 3 to zip, 2 to zip, 1 to zip. When it's going to end up, of course, it's going to be 9 to zip, and if you count the Passover, 10 to zip. Okay, so let me come up with a couple of takeaways that I have. And again, you probably have other takeaways because when God speaks through his word, there's no telling what it's going to trigger in your mind and your heart. But mine are pretty straightforward, having to do with the structure of this. And the first thing I notice is if you argue with God, you better remember that he can up the ante at any time. If God's purpose in this case was to redeem an entire nation for himself. And thirdly, God makes offers and allows choices. One may either accept or reject. And of course, Pharaoh has been on the rejection roll. So let me give you an update. I'm going to risk this just like I did at the beginning. An update on where we are now after 5 plagues. And then I'll let you worry about the 6th one, which is going to get even more severe. Remember, as number 3 in the series, it'll come without any warning, and it will be very, very personal. And each one from now on is going to get increasingly personal. So this update goes something like this. Fish and frog gnat and fly, conspire and cloud our sky. Losing, big old boy, Hebrews jump for joy, and now our livestock die. See